Alright, I'm Kirsten and I'm going to be doing the introduction for global signatures and the dynamical origins of the Little Ice Age and the medieval climate anomaly. The medieval climate anomaly, also known as the MCA, is characterized by warmth over the North Atlantic, southern Greenland, Eurasian Arctic, parts of North America, and is said to occur from 950 to 1250 CE. The medieval climate anomaly. During the medieval climate anomaly, temperatures in some regions were similar to or warmer than today's climate. However, they were well below recent global levels. And as you can see, this is where the medieval period was, and here we are in 2004, so we are still warmer than it was during this warm period. Proxy records show that peak warmth occurred at different times for different regions during the MCA, which indicates that it was not a time of global climate change, that this was all regional, as we talked about in the other papers. Possible causes of the MCA that we talked about again are increased solar activity, decreased volcanic activity, and changes in atmospheric and oceanic circulation.
Oh, there it is.
There's a picture.
Wow.
Okay, so the Little Ice Age, also known as the LIA, was a period of cooling that occurred after the warm period of the medieval climate anomaly. It is said to have occurred from 1400 CE to about 1700 CE. Here's a nice little picture. The weather patterns of the LIA were widespread aridity through the Eurasian subtropics, stronger winter westerlies across the North Atlantic and Western Europe, and shifts in monsoon rainfall patterns across Africa and South Asia. Again, as with the MCA, the timing and locations most affected by the LIA suggest that these were independent regional climate changes rather than worldwide simultaneous increase in glaciation. So again, glaciers increased only in the northern hemisphere up by the area that we have been talking about. Now I'm going to talk about paleoclimatology, which is the study of past climates. Researchers use proxy data to reconstruct these past climates, which are preserved physical characteristics of the environment. And here is just a map showing different proxy data taken from around the globe. As you can see, there's a lot of different types of proxy data, which I will get into. One type of proxy data that is not necessarily scientific are historical documents, which contain observations of weather and climate conditions. They can come from ship and farmer logs, travelers' diaries, and newspaper accounts. Now, the natural recorders for proxy data can be tree rings, ice cores, fossilized data, ocean sediments, and corals. Corals take out the carbonate from the water column, and so the carbonate in their skeletons contains isotopes of oxygen, and these can be used to determine the temperature of the water where the coral grew. And here is a picture of a coral core sample. Pollen is well preserved in lakes and ponds. And researchers can look at the specific shapes and identify the plants based on the pollen growing at the time during sediment deposition. After they identify the plants, they can make inferences about the climate of the area during those times. Here's some pollen, fossilized pollen. The next type of proxy data are ice cores, which have distinct layers that contain dust, air bubbles, and oxygen isotopes, which they differ from year to year based on the surrounding environment, and can tell us a lot about the environment, including temperature, precipitation, atmospheric composition, volcanic activity, and wind patterns.   Tree rings, climate conditions influence the tree growth annually. So researchers can look at the tree ring widths, the density of the tree rings, and the isotopic composition in the rings. This type of proxy data can contain annual records of the climate from hundreds of years to thousands of years based on, or depending on the age of the tree. Sediment cores can be taken from lake and ocean basins. They contain fossils and chemicals which reveal climate, which can tell us about the climate during the deposition of those sediments. Now I'm going to talk about different models and theories. Climate models have been able to simulate the observed global annual average temperature from the last 150 years pretty well. However, it's difficult to reproduce continental scale patterns of climate changes, as we've been discussing. Before the industrial era, externally driven climate change is thought to have been forced primarily by three factors: variation in the solar output, volcanic eruptions, and the North Atlantic Oscillation, or NAO. The North Atlantic Oscillation, NAO, is a phenomenon in the North Atlantic changes in different atmospheric pressures. This NAO controls the strength and direction of westerly winds and storm patterns in the North Atlantic that can ultimately change the climate. Another thing that we've been discussing is volcanic forcing, which an erupting volcano can emit sulfur dioxide, which can reach the stratosphere where it forms sulfate aerosols. These aerosols spread over the hemisphere or the globe and reflect solar radiation back into the atmosphere and leaving the Earth's surface cool. Here's a diagram that Kenny had, or a similar one. These aerosols remain in the stratosphere from 2 to 3 years, except in cases of extremely large eruptions. So researchers are saying now that a series of eruptions may produce effects for over a longer period. However, it's more likely that feedbacks involving ice and ocean can transform these short-term effects into a longer-term effect. Comparison of time series eruptions to climate data suggests that there is some relationship between volcanic forcing and climate change. However, the significance varies between the data and the model type of information. Solar activity is the last one I'm going to talk about. And we found that coincidence of solar activity minima in the 15th and 19th centuries. There is a coincidence between the solar activity minima in the 15th and 19th centuries with periods of cooler temperatures. And models are suggesting that solar variability could account for a large proportion of the temperature variation from 1850 to today. And that's it.
Great, thank you. Kirsten, why don't you just close the mic? Yeah. Okay.
Is that a laptop cover?
It is.
I like your desktop back.
Great,
Ready?
So, Dylan Peck is going to talk to us about this article. And then he's done for the semester.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you about the paper itself and the medieval climate anomaly as well as the Little Ice Age, the article by Matt et al. So first I'm going to review, and just like my Kirsten. So the medieval climate anomaly was a period lasting from about 950 to 1250 CE. It's characterized by warming, within the northern hemisphere, especially the northern Atlantic, while the Little Ice Age, or the LIA, which I will probably be calling it from now on, is a period lasting from around 1400 to 1700 CE, and it is a period of regional cooling, especially in the northern hemisphere, as we just learned. So I'm going to be going over some of the figures that were used within the paper, which were rather confusing. So first of all, this is the entire image, and I'm going to break down each part, but first I'm going to start with the northern hemisphere mean. And so this one right here is actually just a compilation of the 3 other sets of data, and they also use different instrumental mean to form lines. So you can actually see different lines in this one that aren't actually present in the other ones, and I'm just going to go over those real quickly. So first of all, there's your instrumental, and that only starts around 1850 to present day, and that's just the data that we've actually collected through instrument analysis in the last 150 or so years. So as you can see, that's not present in the rest of the graph, and it actually doesn't have any error because that's real data we have. Then there's the EIV-IHD, which is this red line. And what that is when they compiled this data, it had error, obviously, and instead of putting error bars, they took the mean of the error and they just drew another line. And in most areas, it's pretty consistent with the general trend, but sometimes it's not. Screen proxy is the green line that starts around 1300, and this is actually him referencing data that he had written about in another paper, and it's based on a screening process over a calibration interval using a grid box surface temperature data model, and so that's actually present in all of the graphs. It's other data that he had collected and wrote a different paper on. And then this yellow area is the uncertainty interval. And I believe we talked about this a couple weeks ago. And the uncertainty interval is based on the standard deviation of the error, or of the data set. And it's basically saying that within this area there's a 95%, it says uncertainty interval, but you can also call it a 95% certainty level. It's the same term. And so what you see here is, also you see this red box. This red box is meant to be the time period when the medieval climate anomaly took place. And all this blue box, also here, is when the Little Ice Age was supposed to take place. And as you can see, there's a generally normal trend with it's hard to see any raise in temperature in the northern hemisphere mean during the medieval climate anomaly, but you do see a lowering in temperature during the Little Ice Age in the northern hemisphere. Okay, so this is part B. This is talking about the AMO, or the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. So here you can actually see a sea surface temperature. So it's talking about the sea surface temperature in the northern Atlantic. And here you can actually see a pretty significant rise in temperature during the medieval climate anomaly, with a peak during the Little Ice Age, but generally a normal trend during that period that is considered to be Little Ice Age. In C, we're looking at the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and as you can see, again, the medieval climate anomaly doesn't show a very prominent trend towards heating, while it does show a negative trend for the Little Ice Age, indicating cooling. And then finally, D is using La Nino events, or the ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation events. So as you can see, it stays pretty consistent, and this is consistent with data we have about El Nino Southern Oscillation events. And what's interesting is during the medieval climate anomaly, there's actually a decrease in superficial temperatures. This is also focusing on the equatorial regions. And during the Little Ice Age, it stays almost consistent. And so why did he compile all this? Well, he made them into surface temperature models. Okay. So this is figure 2. I split them into 4 different parts, but this is figure 2 talking about the medieval climate anomaly and where the proxy data came from. And so this is rather confusing. One of the things I wanted to talk about is any areas you see these X's, they're actually just dashes. And what they mean is that the regions with those have a p-value of about 0.05. And what that means is, so a lot of this is very confusing because it involves a lot of statistics. Not many of us have taken statistics, I haven't. But what a p-value means is it's gone through a p-test, and it means that the values correlate with what is expected. So you give a estimated number, and then you compare the value against that, and if it matches, then you say that it has a p-value that indicates a correlation. And so these are basically strong data points, while the areas that are just gray are areas that don't have enough proxy data to make any real analysis happen. Well, down here we have what proxy data was used to make this, and the colors and shapes indicate the type of proxy data used, while the relative size indicates the relative use of it. So as you can see here in Africa, there was a large amount of sediments used, while up here there was a very small amount of ice core used. Also, yes, one thing I needed to point out is, if you notice here, this is supposed to be an event of heating, but as you saw in the El Nino slide, there's a period of cooling in the equatorial region in the Pacific, and the author writes about this as the thermostat effect within the Pacific, and this is really critical for the rest of the paper. It's a, what he points out to be a negative feedback, where even during a period of heating, there is cooling in that region. So while it's banded by heating, there is cooling right there. Also, there is a La Nina effect, which is warming in the North Americas while cooling in the Eurasia. Here we have the reconstructed surface temperature model of the LIA. As you can see, there is cooling in the northern hemisphere on the continents, with anomalous warming in the North Atlantic. And again, the data used to make this surface model. Finally, where it gets really confusing is figure 3, I believe. So what they did is they took the models that they had constructed based off of proxy temperature data, and they did what is called, it's a statistical method called difference in differences. So what they did is they basically took the two time periods and like subtracted them. It sounds weird to think of that, but so this is the difference between the two models, and they did that also with models that were plotted by the GISS, or the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, as well as the NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research. The GISS model was based on solar forcing, while the NCAR model was based on solar forcing as well as volcanism. So you do see a general similarity between the three, which is mostly meant to show that the data has some sort of confidence associated with it. Also, so again, it's kind of hard to tell because everything's kind of inverted, but here we go. So we moved on to the barometric data that was in figure 4, I believe. And this is again taken from the NCAR and the GISS. And this is showing the pressures, the atmospheric pressures on the oceans over the northern hemisphere. And so what he wanted to take away from this is that in the GISS model, he stated that there's actually a positive phase of the NAO, or as Kirsten explained, the North Atlantic Oscillation. So you can see that in Europe there is heating, while in Iceland there is cooling, and this promotes westerly winds, and this is something that the author wanted to harp on, while there is no real trend in the NCAR model. Some of the limitations about this is that the NCAR model, as the author pointed out, didn't account for ozone when studying solar forcing, while the GISS model did, so there was some difference in data. And while models are very effective, the author also points out that there is natural variabilities that aren't being taken into account when these models are made, and they just can't seem to take them into account because they're so far in the past. Some of the future applications of this is through a extended proxy network, if we can possibly get more data points, a more confident model could be made. And if this tropical Pacific thermostat response does exist, perhaps we can use a better model to see how it will react to the current changes in climate that we're experiencing today.